In this video, we're going to overview the web application template, some of the capabilities, how to do a few things, but we're not going to go into great detail. The template itself is the documentation, and you can read it and kind of learn all the ins and outs, but let's go ahead and just get started and show you how to actually get it installed and what it does. Right now on my desktop, I already have the application template zip file downloaded here, and we can open it up and you'll see there's a folder in here with the template itself. To install, all you really need to do is simply copy this folder into your web server. Now, your web server may be local, might be hosted, let's say for example GoDaddy, doesn't really matter, but as long as your web server supports PHP is the main component for this web template. If you're not familiar with PHP, go ahead and search for it, find out how to get it working in your web server environment. If you're hosted, I said like GoDaddy for example, it's already there and you're ready to go. Right now I'm using Windows operating system with IIS, and I've enabled PHP support for that. If I go over to my C web folder, that's where my website actually currently is. Let me go ahead and show you. If I go into 127.0.0.1 in a browser, you can see because my folder is empty right now, it can't find a website to actually view. So what we're going to do is we're going to open that zip file, and I'm going to drag and drop that app template folder into my web server folder. Now the first thing you probably want to do is actually rename that and give that folder name some kind of name to your application. My widget application, for example. I'm going to name mine Sandbox. And there we go. So let's go back to the browser, and I will go to Sandbox. And we're already running the web application. Now here you'll see a mock-up login page I've created. I don't know what your web application is going to do. Everything here is completely optional. You can delete this login file if you want, don't use it. Go straight to the interface. There's a lot of settings you'll see of how you can customize the web template to work with your application. Alright, let's go back to the folder structure. And we'll go into that Sandbox folder, and you'll see kind of a folder structure which we'll talk about. The first thing to look at is this Getting Started README file. It will talk about getting to the admin panel to get you started configuring your web application. It even talks about there's a default password. What we're looking for here is the admin path. So let's go back to the web browser, and after Sandbox, I'm going to add the word admin. And this takes me to the login to the admin tools. Now your URL may be different. This may have a domain name in front of it. You may put it into other folder, subfolders, things like that. But really what you're looking for is the folder you copied and admin in the path. So default password is password. Remember the README file tells you how to get here, and it even tells you how to change that default password. And it even recommends deleting that text file once you've done that because you're good to go. So here we are, we're in the actual documentation of the web template, and we're in the tools for the web template. So we can do quite a few things here. Like I said, I'm going to go over a brief overview of what it can do, but read this documentation in detail to get a precise answer of how to do everything and all the details. Alright, so the first thing you'll see is I'm actually using HTML, JavaScript, and PHP to write the template. That's the reason PHP is important, that your server supports that. I do include the jQuery and jQuery libraries, UI libraries. They're already ready to go if you're familiar with that library. I'm not limiting you on any library whatsoever. For example, let's go back to that root folder, and you'll see this starting index file. You can include whatever libraries you want. Here are the two files I have for jQuery. Now there are some things that my template needs that are jQuery related, so even if you don't use jQuery, please leave those lines in there. But you can put your own style sheets, any other type of includes that you want on your code. But everything you see here is the template itself, and we'll get into that in more detail here in a second. Some of the cool features of this template are it supports the development and production level environment, meaning you typically want to do all your coding and development and then move it over into a production environment once you know it's working. So it has some really nice tools to help keep those be in sync and things like that. I've also written some JavaScript and PHP functions you may find useful. You may never use them at all. You may use them all, but they're there if you want to use them or not. The pre-designed CSS interface components. Also have quite a few of those. The admin panel itself has all your documentation, has a lot of configuration tools. Database management is a really big part of this template. We're going to get into that here in a second. But let's go ahead and just jump right into it. The documentation, we'll go into installation here, and this basically talks about just what we did earlier. We copied that folder into my web server. Now it does recommend creating a couple of copies, maybe 2 or 3, 4 copies of this. For example, I'm going to copy the sandbox folder, and let's go ahead and rename this one to sandbox_prod. Now I have a development folder and a production level folder. Now these do not have to exist on the same web server. One could be an entirely different server hosted, and the other one could be local. Does not matter. In my example, they just happen to be side by side. It even talks about creating a sandbox copy just for playing around, learning it. If you break the sandbox, delete it, recopy the folder, start all the way over. Hopefully you won't break it that easily, and I did my job well then. Moving on to documentation, we'll go into application design. As I said, the trickiest part about creating a web application template is I have no clue what you're going to do. What, are you going to code a web page about your coin collection, or are you going to do a Fortune 500 application that supports 10,000 users? I don't know. So I've created a lot of tools and functions that I find useful in applications I've designed in the past, and I have to use them almost in every application. There again, you may not use any of them, but they're there for you to use. But this document talks about those features, and also talks about a method of how to design your web application. One thing I suggest is actually loading all the interface components and just hiding or showing what you're not using at that time, but leaving them all in memory. The old school way of doing web documentation was you click a link, it takes you to a page. You click another link, it takes you to another page. The problem with that in application design is you may have a lot of data that you have to migrate from page to page to page. If you just hide and show interface components, you never have to manipulate that data and move it over anywhere. It's always there to use in your application. And that kind of just talks about that here. Back to documentation, we'll go into folders. You saw the folder structure that I had in my sandbox folder, and this kind of talks about the different folders. Right now we are in the admin folder. This is the admin tools. The root folder really should only contain that index file. You'll be deleting that text file once you're done reading it. You'll do most of your work in your code folder, adding your own files, PHP files. You can even add ASP files if you really like, or other language type files. I try not to limit you on what you want to do in this thing, just give you a helpful hand for other type of scenarios in your application. Of course, images, storing your images, interface folders where you store your style sheets, and it also might be where you can store all your files that contain your interface components, like your divs and your tables, layouts, things like that. The template does support logging, and there's a logs folder to actually store those log files. We'll see that here in a second. The resources folder, you'll probably never go into that. That is the template itself. That's all the background stuff that I did. This is completely open source. If you want to dig around in the resources folder and do some coding there, by all means, go for it. Moving on, we'll look at the files. Now this is pretty cool. This is what I call living documentation. So in each file, you want to document as much as you can. And that's great. That's going to be there for your coworkers that go in and code and stuff. But a lot of times I find managers, they want to see the documentation too. And some even ask, hey, can you document it over here because I don't want to go dig through all your files. That's what this area is all about. It has actually scanned all of these folders and found every single file that's in these folders and give you a description of the file. I can click the show updates, and it'll even show you the last time it was edited and who edited and what happened. Really, this is pretty simple. There's a little header down here it talks about that you'd include at the very top of your page, and you fill out the description and your update logs you add onto it, and it automatically adds this information to this page. Let me go ahead and show you this in real time. I'm going to go into the code folder, and let's just copy this shared functions file. Copy it. I'm going to go and edit that file. Let's change the description to testing 1, 2, 3, and we can copy one of these log statements and just say hello. Alright, go ahead and save that file. We'll jump back over to our documentation, and I'll just go back into this files to refresh it. And right here you can immediately see it found that new file, gave us our description that we have set. If I click the Show Updates button, we see all the updates I have right here, and we're documented. We're documented in the file, and we're documented in this admin tools. This is where I would send my manager to read about all my files. So really cool to have that in one spot. Alright, moving into documentation, we'll go to Images. This is simply going into the Images folder and showing you every image that's in here. You can see if it's transparent or not, see the sizes, even gives you a nice little snippet for HTML to actually copy and paste into your code, and things like that. Alright, moving on to go to Functions. Sorry if I'm moving quick, there's a lot to cover, and all the details are here for you to read anyway. The functions goes out and scans these three folders and finds every PHP and JavaScript function in those folders. For example, it says here's a getURLValue function. In this file, it's a PHP function and it's on line 10. Gives you the description. I can click Show Details. It'll even give me the inputs, the outputs, and the notes of that function. So really handy here. If I click the magnifying glass here, it'll even tell me all the files that actually call this function and the line numbers and how they're actually called. So you don't have to go digging in your code to find trails of code that you're looking for of function use. So really powerful stuff. And just like files, all you have to do is take this little snippet and copy it inside your function at the very top, and you can fill out all the details that would show up here. So there again, it's it's commented in your code itself, and it's commented in this one place, user-friendly, great for managers to come in here and see all the documentation about your functions. And it's a good place to learn about all the functions that I give you as part of the template. Your functions will show up here as long with my functions too. And I do give you a resources button if you want to dig and look at all the functions that the resource folder contains that are in the background. Back to documentation, we'll go to variables. And in here, it's basically talking about this code globals file. Let's go ahead and look at that. I currently have 3 global variables currently set. I have a loading variable, debug variable, and an application variable. The loading variable basically is a true/false, and it's there to say false when the application is finished loading all its components. And this may be important to something you're coding. There again, you may never use this variable at all. Debug PHP variable, it's either going to be blank or set to something. And we'll see a debug panel here in just a second what all that's about. And then the application is an array variable that holds a lot of information, and we'll get into all those details of the information it holds here in just a second. But it's really good to document your global variables so somebody doesn't use the same variable name inside of a function. Then those variable names might conflict because these are global. Back to documentation, we'll go over to interface. Earlier when I was in documentation application design, I talked about a method that I suggest when doing your web design or your application web design, and that is to load all your interface components into memory and only show or hide what you care about at that time. And this talks about this in a little more detail and talks about the file that you want to edit to do it and a function to actually include that, that interface object. Or interface file in this case. You have an entire file with a table and a lot of divs. You can include that one file at once. For example, here's a parameter you use on the function called visible. By default it's true, but you can turn that to false, so it's loaded into memory but it's not shown by default. You've got to set the code to actually show it. Any interface item that gets loaded this way actually gets a class called interface item, and with a simple line of jQuery or JavaScript you can hide all your interface components in one quick command. Back to documentation, we'll go to sync inputs. Now syncing inputs is something I find very useful on a lot of applications. For example, let's say I ask somebody for a customer name, an email address, an address and a phone number. But later on in the application, I may want to ask for the exact same information in case they forgot to fill it out in the first page. The problem with that is now every time they fill out name in one page, I got to remember to copy all that data over to the other pages and make sure the other name is synced. Because I don't want that to fill out twice, and I don't want to lose information and I want all those fields to be synced. That's what this system's about. For example, up here I have a text box and I type something in here and I click away and it automatically syncs to this other text box. Here's how simple this is. In my example, I have 3 text fields, 3 text areas, and 3 select boxes. Each one of these items has a unique class, but it's the same one in each one. So for example, these text areas, sync_age, all 3 of them have that class. As long as the class starts with sync underscore, it knows it's a sync type object. And then whatever you want to create as the prefix, or sorry, suffix here, gets synced. So if I change this here, click, change this one down here, click away, it automatically syncs all 3 of those fields. Same thing with the text area. All of these have sync_info, and then the select has sync my choice. And you can see all 3 of those are synced also. So a really cool way of syncing your data. There again, this only works if you preloaded all of your interface components to the memory itself. Moving over to configuration, we'll go to application settings. And here are some quick application settings. For example, the level we talked about, development or production. Earlier in my web folder, I have 2 folders. One of these I would consider the development level, and the other one the production level. And inside the admin tool of each one of these, I would set one or the other. Since I'm working in Sandbox right now, I'll go ahead and leave this in development mode. The other one, start page. How do I want to start the application? Do I want it to go to a login page, or do I want to go directly to the interface page? Let me show you how this works. I'm going to click the Start App button here on the very top right, and it should start the application. And you can see I immediately went to the login page here. But if I change that to interface, go ahead and save, and then I start my application, it takes me directly to the interface and bypasses the login completely. And here I have a demo interface file that you can delete later on, just to show you some of the options I have here. For example, I demo the sync again right there. So the other one, log files, do you want to enable or disable that? We'll see log files here in just a second, where those get stored. EXE required, I'll talk about an EXE I've written. It's completely optional. You don't have to use an EXE with your web app, but it has some really cool features, which we'll see. The title of your application, let's go ahead and do testing 123 and save that. And we'll go ahead and start our app. And you can see up here, it actually says testing 123 on our title. Now it doesn't do just the tab. It actually stored this value in a global array. Now remember earlier when I went to documentation variables, we talked about the application array that's global, and one of these is the title itself. There it is, application title. And I can actually use that in an alert or a HTML tag to show the title of my application, but I don't have to change it in multiple places. I can just call this variable and then use the configuration application settings and do all that. Same thing with version number, contact information. I don't really even use this anywhere, but you may have a help file that you actually want to link and send an email to a certain contact person. Also under configuration, let's go to custom style guide. And in here, this is talking about something called an override style guide. Let's go ahead and look at our interface folder. I'll show you what I mean. In the interface, we have a stylesheet.css, which you'll be doing most of your CSS style guides, but I have this config override CSS that gets called after this style sheet. So I can set something that will override this style sheet, and I can easily set it right here. A lot of times when I'm coding, I find, oh, I just want to change that hue just a little bit, but it's really cumbersome to go into the style guide and have to edit the RGB or the hex code and do all that information just to see one tiny change. I'd rather do it with a mouse, do real quick, refresh, and see my changes. That's what this is all about. For example, I already have one set for development mode, and I have a background color of yellow. So you can see here, when I'm in development mode, my background color is yellow right here. Let's go ahead and edit that. Let's change it to a nice pink color. I'll go ahead and save. Let's go back in here and refresh. And there we go. We have pink as our background color. Now you can add your own. I'll go ahead and do one here. Let's add one. And then for the ID, this is exactly what you would type in your style guide as the ID for your style. For example, if I want to talk about all divs, I would type in div. Or if I wanted to talk about an ID, I would do # my object. Or let's go ahead and do a class. For class, I'll do period, and we'll just do test. I'll go ahead and add that to the list. You can see it's here. Nothing's filled out yet, so I'll go ahead and edit that. We'll go ahead and change the font family. Let's say Times New Roman. We'll do a font size. Let's go way up to 38. The color we'll set as a green, and the background color, let's do kind of a dark blue. And you can see kind of a demo here of what it's going to look like. So I'll go ahead and save it. You can see all the settings got saved here. And let's go ahead and edit this demo file and see what it looks like. So I'll go into my interface folder, go into that demo PHP file, and let's just create a div somewhere. Or actually, let's just do this H2. We'll add class and add a class called test. We'll go ahead and save that. Let's go back to our interface and refresh. And you can see there's the background color, the font color change, size, font style, everything is changed to what we have set right here. So a really cool way of doing style guides, and I think you'll find that speeds up the process quite a bit for doing some simple CSS. Going back to configuration, we'll go into database connections. Now database is why I really wrote this template, because trying to explain database, dynamic queries, connections, all that to my some coworkers sometimes is a little frustrating because they don't use it every day. A month later they forgot everything I told them about how to code that. So I wanted to create an easy interface here so they can actually start working with database, new queries, things like that. So the first thing we're going to do in database connections is, of course, create an actual connection to a database. I have a MySQL and a SQL Server running on my system right now, but it could be anywhere. It could be hosted on another network server, anything like that. But I'm going to go ahead and connect to my local MySQL server. So I'll click Add. First thing it asks for is an application level, both development or production. The cool thing about this is I can have a query with the exact same ID, and depending on the development level I'm in, it will switch over to the connection type automatically that I have set here for development or production. So I'm going to go ahead and choose both because I'm only going to be dealing with one database right now. So I'll go ahead and give it a name. I'll just call it my dev MySQL, something like that. Choose the type. Right now I support MySQL and Microsoft SQL. Maybe in the future I'll add a version that supports other types. I'll go ahead and choose MySQL. My username, for me, it's root. I'll go ahead and use that. Password, I'm not going to tell you that. The address, mine just happens to be on the same system, so I'll just use 127.0.0.1. And if I had an optional port, I could choose that there. Let's go ahead and hit the test button, and you can see I have a connection that was successful. So I can click the add button, and I'm ready to go. I can start writing queries that uses that dev MySQL connection that I created. So we'll go into configuration, jump over to database queries, and we will look at how to do a query. Now there's a lot of documentation about how to use the database query function, and we'll get to that in just a second, but let's actually create a query first. So I'll jump over to MySQL, and you can see right now I have a test database with a test table and just a couple of rows of data. I've got a name column and an age column, John Doe 55, Jane Doe 32. Just something real simple and a really simple select query to get going. So I'll go ahead and copy that select query. I'll add a new query. I'll give it some kind of ID. Let's call it name and age, since that's what I'm about to get. Now I can have two queries with the same name. That's where that development production level connection comes in, because it will automatically look for the query ID that's in the level you're currently in. So I'll go ahead and choose the only database connection I have, which is that dev MySQL one. And then I'll go ahead and paste in the query. Now up here it says query type select or other, and once you start writing your query, it should figure out which one it is. Select is something that actually returns data, and other is something that performs an action, a query action. Let's say delete, insert, update, those kind of things. But this one's a select query. All right, let's go ahead and test that. And you can see here's the query it ran and the number of rows it returned. So we have a working query. The problem with this query, though, it's very tiny. It's not going to be the queries you're probably going to write. You're going to probably have a page full of queries here. And your queries are going to be dynamic. For example, let's go to MySQL and make a kind of a dynamic query. I'm going to add a where statement to this query and say where age is greater than 40. And you can see here Jane Doe is not greater than 40, so when I run this, she should disappear from the results. And sure enough, we only get John Doe. So let's go ahead and take that query, paste it over in our tool. It's not dynamic yet because I have 40 currently written here. That's where the add new text replacement comes in. So what you want to do is actually create some kind of string here to replace 40 that naturally would not occur in your query. I'll give you an example. Let's do open bracket, the word age in uppercase, and close bracket. So I can actually replace this secret little word here with a value. So I'll click add new text replacement, type in my keyword, and then I can go ahead and give it a test value for right now. Let's go ahead and do 40, run my query, and you can see when it ran, it replaced that keyword with my test value of 40, and you can see it right there in the query statement. Now when you're actually using the function, it talks about how to pass in all of these values as an array to actually run this. This is just for this test button right here, this 40 statement. And then I can do 38. You can see it working in real time. All right, so that's kind of how to do the queries. Like I said, read all the documentation. The one important thing to note here on the documentation is I actually start all my data on segment 1 of the returned two-dimensional array that this function returns. The reason I do that is I put some information on the 0 segment that will always be there. Even if this query failed, you will have all this information. For example, the error message that it may return, the number of rows that got returned, the connection ID, the query itself, the keys. When I'm referring to keys, I'm referring to these columns that get returned in your column or your query. So read up on that. So there's a JavaScript variable for doing database work, and there is the exact same query name for PHP, but it does have some extra instructions including the file, but it does everything that the JavaScript query does for you. All right, moving on to configuration, we'll go to Launcher EXE. This is 100% optional, but I find it really cool. The web browser is really limited on what things it can do with the operating system. In this case, the Windows operating system. So I've created a Windows EXE here that can actually launch your website and give it things like the Windows username or the computer name that they're using. That could be really useful for IT for tracking down whoever's using this website and maybe having problems. It can also be a security feature, and I'll show you that here in just a second. It's written in .NET. I gave you the source code. All you really do is create a shortcut to the exe, give it the URL of your web app, and now it can launch the web app. So let me show you a couple things it can actually do for security. I'm going to go back to configuration, back to application settings, and remember that exe required option where it's disabled right now. I'll go ahead and choose enabled, hit save, and let's go ahead and refresh our document. And you can see it says you are not authorized to view this site. I have to have that exe in order to start my website. So that's kind of what the exe is for. Open source, give you all the code. There's a lot of cool things you can do. An exe can talk to almost anything in Windows. Now Java is another web language that can talk to exe and do things. But the web browser itself typically can't unless you're using Internet Explorer and ActiveX. I've heard rumors of ActiveX being deprecated in the future, so it may not be a reliable source, but an exe always is. All right, let's move on to maintenance, and we'll go to user logs. Now for user logs, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the login. So I'm going to go back to configuration, application settings, and change the start page back to login and save that. I'm also going to turn off exe required. All right, There's my login page. I'll go ahead and log in as guest. And then we can go back to our admin tools, maintenance, user logs. And you'll see right there, there's my guest log file ready for me to view. So I click that, and we can see it's already logged a few things. And there's a function I've already built in called logit. You just give it a string, and it writes all this information, date, time, and what you told it to write. Now you may see this other file name out here. This is with a lot of information. The hard part about log files is you've got to have a unique user in order to log for that user. You don't want to jumble all your log files and every user into one file because you couldn't tell which user is what file. When you have a login, like we had here, I can just use the username as the prefix of my log file. But if you don't have a login, I found a method to actually go out, and this number is the hardware storage identifier for the web browser itself. It's unique. It's very unique. The only way to ever change that number is to reinstall this browser or your operating system. So it should stick with that user for quite a long time. And I'll show you how to actually ask the user to give you that so you can find their log file if you need it here in just a second. Let's go ahead and look at the folder where the logs are stored. You can see those files are right here. Now you'll see the word July, or JUL for July, is written into the file name. Every time a user comes back in here, if they're in a new month, let's say we're in the next month, which is August, it would automatically move that July file into the archive folder. So you're only logging really a month at a time. So these log files just don't grow into like terabyte size after a year or so. And you can always go over here and look at the archive log files and find those. Alright, let's moving on to maintenance debug panel. One of my favorite features of this template is the debug panel, and this is the debug panel as part of the application. A lot of documentation, but let's show you the real thing. So I've been using the Start App button here on the top right, but there's another button underneath it that says Start App with Debug Panel. I'll go ahead and click that, and you can see it actually started my application, and it opened up another tab here for the debug panel. Let's see what goodies we have. First thing is we have an application session log, and if I show that, it will show what's currently going on in the session. For example, if I log in, let's do guest, and go back here and refresh this, it's actually logged just that session. Now we do have a button for the log file if logging is enabled, and if you click that, it will show that log file. Now a log file is a physical file. A session log is not. It's going to be deleted as soon as they close down the application. But this physical log file is always there, and you can actually see there's a divider between each session that I've opened up. I've logged in twice now. So that's pretty cool. Just got to make sure you hit the refresh button if you want to see the latest log, because this is real time here. It just doesn't refresh in real time. Another cool feature is the array values. Remember that application global array I showed earlier? Well, here it is again, but we can actually click the show button and we can see all of those values we have set. Now over my documentation on global variables, I talk about every single one of these variables. Earlier I showed you how to get that client ID if you don't have a username, and there it is. So you can actually have somebody come in here and send you that. A lot of times I'll even have somebody come in here and hit Control-A, copy everything on this page and email me the information, because there's a lot of details and I don't want them to read it out over the phone. One of my favorites is what browser they're using. If they're using an unsupported browser, I can easily see it right there, what they're currently using. So go into the documentation to learn about all these cool things. But you can actually include your own variables here. Let's go ahead and edit the debug file. I'm going to go into the code folder and open the debug.php file. And inside the array values area, you'll see I have a function that actually went out and dumped that application array. So let's go copy it, paste another line, and typically you would put in your own array variable here to spit out. So we'll go ahead and save that, come back to debug and refresh, and you can see I have both those arrays being shown right there with all the values. But if I came in and let's say, let me go ahead and refresh this, and currently it says I'm in the login screen, but if I go and log in, go back to debug, and refresh this, it says now I'm on the interface loaded page. There's a nice little function I have to actually updating the last event, which is pretty cool. So that's kind of how to use array values. The other feature here is the DOM interface objects. Let's go back to my interface and refresh one more time. So we're here at the login screen, and we'll look at all of the current interface objects I have loaded. For example, buttons, text, images, tables, and it shows you all that information. There's another button here called Show On Events, and you can even see the on-click events, the on-key down events, things like that. So kind of a snapshot of what your interface DOM looks like. If you're not familiar with the DOM, it's a document object model. It's basically what's in memory for your web app. I'm only concentrating on the interface components, not the entire DOM. The DOM is pretty big, but alright, if I go in and do a login, now we're off the login page. We have an entirely different interface here. I can come back and refresh, and you can see all the other stuff disappeared and all the new interface objects are here. We talked about earlier hiding and showing components. Even if a component is hidden but it's still in memory, it will show in this list. So really cool. The other function I give you is way up here. There's a little test button, and really all you have to do is code this debug test function in the debug file. Let's go look at that real quick. Has some old code there. And so I can do alert 1, for example. And now if I go refresh and run that code, and I can do the code right there. It allows you to add test code, kind of ad hoc test, without ever editing your application. You can just do it right here in the debug panel and see what's going on for some custom testing. Now you can also add your own stuff. Just edit this debug file and add all your own sections to the code here and create your own debug routines. Let's go back to the documentation, back to maintenance, and we'll go to file usage. File usage is basically trying to show you how many files you have and which ones are linked or not linked to a file. For example, that getting started README file, I'm not actually using that in my web template. So it's gray here and it says times use 0. So later on I can go out and delete that file. It's pretty safe to delete. The exception to that rule is index.php. That's my starting page file. It's actually not referenced on purpose because that's where you start. So it will typically have 0 here. I don't recommend deleting that. Check this out. Here's our copy of our functions file we did early in the video, and of course I'm not referencing it because this is a copy of a file. You can click Show Details, and it'll even show you which files have a reference to the file and how many times. So really good information, trying to find those lost files that may have not been used in 3 years that you can probably get rid of. Alright, moving back into maintenance, we'll go to Compare Application Levels. And this is another cool feature I like, and it's trying to get your development and your production levels in sync at all times. So really it's asking for what are the paths to your index.php file. So let's go ahead and copy that path. Here's my path for my dev. So I'll go ahead and paste that in there. If we look back in that folder structure, the other one is called Sandbox Prod. Now this could be on an entirely different server, but I just got to give it that path to where it's currently at. So sandbox_prod. We'll go ahead and hit save. And there we go. It's actually compared the levels. For example, here in missing files, it found a file that's in development, but not found in production. So that's a file that I might want to copy over to production to make sure they're in sync. Here's some files that I've edited because they have a different modified date or a different file size, and I want to make sure that I copy over and make sure development and production are in sync. Even a list of all the files that have been modified in the last 7 days. For example, I'm about to work in the index.php file, and I see somebody's worked on it in the last couple of days. I might want to go ask a coworker, hey, is there anything I need to know before I touch this file? So really good information. And it shows every single file because I've copied over everything and they're fresh on my hard drive. But after 7 days, these would all start disappearing from that list. And that's pretty much it for the template. The help here is just really documentation to help you out if you're new to coding some of these languages. The template itself will spoil you, but I do suggest learning as much as you can about each language. I myself is going to be spoiled by the database configuration with this template, but I don't want to lose how to do it manually, because I don't code everything for you. I have no clue what your application is going to do, and you still need to do a lot of custom coding for that application. But hopefully this template has enough features in it to help shortcut some of that development and make your application design the focus and not the background routines that are typical of part of a web application. That's it for this video of an overview. Go into this documentation, read as much as you can, and I hope you have fun creating a web app.